All right, so let's dive into what was definitely a headline-grabbing week. President Trump's second week back in office.
Back with a bang, you might say.
Yeah, not exactly the quiet re-entry some folks were predicting.
Not even close.
Our main source is this AP News article. It came out February 1st, 2025. The title kind of says it all. Trump's second week in office delivers jolts and chaotic orders with a mix of politics and tragedy. Where do we even begin?
Well, it's striking how quickly things went from, I guess you could say, calm to chaos.
Right.
That first week back, there was this feeling of maybe, just maybe, things would be different this time around.
A more seasoned, less.
Exactly, a more measured approach, maybe learned from past experience.
And then bam, week 2 hits and we're like, wait, haven't we seen this movie before?
Deja vu, the article even says.
Totally. Like one big flashback to the first term, and nothing says flashback, like that whole grant funding freeze. Talk about a mess.
Oh, absolutely. That one really threw everyone for a loop.
It seemed to come out of nowhere.
And the fallout was immediate. I mean, you have lawsuits popping up, communities panicking because they rely on those funds, and then the administration did a complete 180, reversed course just like that.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what was the plan there? Or was there even a plan?
Right. Like, was there a coherent decision-making process? It's hard to tell from the outside. What's really interesting here, though, isn't just the policy itself, it's the way it was rolled out. Like, this confusing internal memo, that's what sparked the whole thing.
So is this a sign of things to come? Should we expect this kind of, I don't know, chaotic policymaking to be the norm?
Well, it's too early to say for sure, but it definitely raises some concerns, right? I mean, this wasn't some obscure program. These grants, they impact everything, healthcare, housing, all sorts of vital stuff.
It's not like they were messing with funding for, like, National Yo-Yo Day or something.
Exactly. And the fallout was so immediate and widespread. It makes you wonder, is this a sign of a bigger problem, like a systemic
Yeah.
issue within the administration?
Or was it just I don't know, a rookie mistake, something they can learn from?
That's the question, isn't it? It could be either, or maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a red flag. It kind of feeds into this broader worry about how policies are going to be implemented under this administration. If something as fundamental as grant disbursement is this messy, what's going to happen when they tackle more complex issues?
Okay, good point. So let's shift gears a bit. Talk about Trump's campaign promise to shake things up in Washington. It was a big part of his message, right? Like, I'm going to drain the swamp.
Oh, yeah, that was his bread and butter.
And he clearly had certain institutions in his sights, like the ones he perceived as opposed to his agenda. And right out of the gate, the pardons for those involved in the January 6th riot, that was a pretty strong signal. What did you make of that?
Well, it was definitely a bold move, and it set the tone for what was to come. I mean, those pardons, they were just the opening act. What followed was a whole series of actions targeting specific people and entire institutions, like removing prosecutors who were working on January 6th cases, pushing out top officials at the FBI, even demanding to know the names of agents involved in those investigations.
Wow. So it wasn't just about, like, personnel changes. It was about something bigger.
Right. It felt like a power move, an attempt to take control and undermine any investigations that could potentially threaten him.
It's almost like he's trying to dismantle the system from the inside out.
Yeah, it does have that feel to it, doesn't it?
So the big question is this about genuine reform, like he claims? Or is it something more, I don't know, something more concerning, like an attempt to consolidate power and shield himself from being held accountable?
That's the million-dollar question. It's hard to know for sure what's going on in his head, right?
Yeah.
But the impact is real. And it raises serious questions about the future of institutions like the Justice Department and the FBI. I mean, if people start to see them as compromised, as politically motivated, it undermines their legitimacy and erodes public trust, which is incredibly damaging in the long run.
Makes sense. And the shakeups, it didn't stop there, right? We had a high-ranking Treasury official resign. There was that whole thing about gender ideology being removed from federal websites. It felt like a purge. Like anything that didn't fit a very specific worldview was being targeted.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a deliberate effort to reshape the federal bureaucracy in a very particular image. And that raises a question for all of us. What happens when ideological purity becomes the most important thing for serving in government?
Instead of, like, experience or qualifications.
Exactly. What does that mean for having diverse viewpoints, for having experts who can actually do the job? And ultimately, what does it mean for the government's ability to serve the needs of all Americans, not just a select few?
It's a good question, and one that I think we're going to be grappling with for a while. Okay, so then we've got Trump's fixation on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. He seems to see it as the source of all kinds of problems, which, to be honest, is a little baffling.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher for sure. This focus on DEI, it's been building for a while now. We saw it in his first term, but now it seems to have become like a central theme.
Yeah.
He's already issued orders to dismantle federal DEI programs. He's requiring federal workers to report on any ongoing initiatives, and he even went so far as to blame DEI for that mid-air collision near Reagan National Airport.
Hold on, wait. The plane crash. How is he even connecting those two things?
Yeah, it's a stretch, to say the least. There's
Yeah.
no evidence to support that claim, and it feels more like he's trying to scapegoat DEI for a complex event that probably had multiple contributing factors. But it does speak to his tendency to latch onto a narrative, even if it's not based in reality.
Right. Even if it doesn't make sense, he's got his story and he's sticking to it. It's almost like he's created this bogeyman out of DEI, and he's using it to stoke fear and division. But what's the point? What's he actually trying to accomplish by dismantling these programs?
It's hard to say for sure, but it does seem to be part of a larger effort to roll back what he sees as woke ideology, both in government and in society as a whole. And that's worrying because it creates a chilling effect. If people are afraid to even talk about diversity and inclusion, how can we address systemic inequities? How can we build a more just and equitable society?
It feels like we're taking a giant step backward.
It certainly has that feel to it, doesn't it?
Okay, let's move on to what the article calls Trump's first major policy stumble, that attempted freeze on federal grant funding.
Oh yeah, that was a doozy. Not only was it a bad policy, but the way they tried to implement it was just, well, disastrous.
It was a mess. I mean, suddenly halting all those funds, it sent shockwaves through communities all across the country. Essential services were disrupted, infrastructure projects were put on hold. It impacted everything.
It really did, and the backlash was immediate and intense. Remember what Senator Schumer said? Every corner of the country is feeling the wrath of Donald Trump's cruel plan.
Yeah, I remember that. It seems like they really underestimated just how much people rely on those funds.
They definitely miscalculated. It's a classic example of ideology clashing with reality. They came in with this idea of slashing government spending, but they completely failed to grasp the real-world consequences of their actions.
They weren't just abstract budget lines, right? These cuts were going to directly hurt people, impacting their lives and their communities.
Exactly, and that's why the backlash was so strong. They had to back down. There was no other choice.
But even though they rescinded the freeze, those underlying executive orders, the ones aimed at cutting spending, those are still in effect, right?
That's correct. So the question now becomes, what's next? Are they going to try to find a less disruptive, more strategic way to achieve their spending reduction goals? Or are they going to double down on this confrontational approach?
And risk even more backlash.
Exactly. And potentially face even greater political fallout. Only time will tell.
It feels like we've talked about a year's worth of news already, and we're only halfway through this deep dive. So much for a calm second term, huh?
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind for sure. And it's not just the volume of activity, it's the potential long-term consequences that are really concerning.
Right, like we talked about with the Justice Department, the FBI, even that whole grant funding mess, it all points to this pattern of, I don't know, like undermining these institutions that are so important for a functioning democracy.
Absolutely. It's like
Yeah.
chipping away at the foundation. And it makes you wonder about that whole draining the swamp rhetoric from the campaign. Was this the plan all along? To dismantle the system from within?
It's a scary thought.
It is. And it gets even more worrisome when you look at what's happening with the federal workforce. That fork in the road email, it wasn't just about offering buyouts. It was sending a message loud and clear.
Yeah.
Get on board or get out.
Yeah, and for those who chose to stay, well, they're facing a whole new reality now. Full-time office work, stricter conduct standards, and this looming threat of future downsizing. It seems like a pretty deliberate attempt to reshape the culture of government, to get rid of anyone who's seen as disloyal or, not ideologically aligned.
It's about control, isn't it?
Yeah.
Creating an environment where everyone is either fully on board with the agenda or too afraid to speak up. And that's where the real danger lies. We could be looking at a massive brain drain. Experienced, knowledgeable civil servants, people who've dedicated their careers to public service. They're being pushed out
And replaced by
by loyalists. People whose primary qualification is their allegiance to the administration, not necessarily their expertise or experience.
And what does that mean for the government's ability to actually function, to do its job?
Well, think about it. You're trying to run this incredibly complex organization, the federal government, without the people who know how it works, who understand the intricacies of policy and procedure. It's a recipe for disaster.
And not just in terms of efficiency, right, but in terms of accountability, in terms of being able to provide essential services to people.
Exactly. If agencies are struggling to function, if they're short-staffed and demoralized, who suffers? The citizens, the people who rely on those services.
So we've got potential chaos brewing within the government, and then we throw in those trade wars. It's like poking a hornet's nest, isn't it? Trump's back at it with tariffs, this time targeting Canada, Mexico, and China. Haven't we learned anything from the past?
You would think so, wouldn't you? But it seems like we're back to the same old playbook. Slap on some tariffs, claim it's about protecting American jobs and security, and then watch as other countries retaliate.
And they are retaliating. I mean, those Canadian hockey fans booing the U.S. anthem, that was a pretty clear message, right?
Oh yeah. These actions, they have consequences that go far beyond economics. They damage relationships, they undermine alliances, they create this atmosphere of distrust and uncertainty.
And that makes it a whole lot harder to deal with those big global challenges that require cooperation, right? Like climate change, pandemics, terrorism.
Exactly. These aren't things any one country can solve on its own. We need to be working together, not against each other.
It feels like we're retreating from the world stage, becoming more isolated and less influential. And Trump might argue he's putting America first, but is he really? Or is he actually weakening our position globally?
I think that's a legitimate question. There's a big difference between asserting your interests and alienating your allies. And in this case, it seems like he's doing both.
Okay, so let's shift gears again. We've talked a lot about the big picture stuff, but I want to bring it back down to earth for a minute. All of this, these policies, these actions, they have real-world consequences for people.
Absolutely. And that's something we should never lose sight of. We're not talking about abstract numbers or political points. We're talking about families who are struggling to make ends meet, communities losing access to vital services, businesses shutting down.
The article mentions a study from Yale University that estimated Trump's previous tariffs cost American households somewhere between $1,000 to $1,200 per year in purchasing power. That's a significant hit, especially for folks who are already struggling to get by.
It is, and that's just one example. We haven't even talked about the potential impact on healthcare costs, education, access to affordable housing. These are issues that affect every aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
And they're all being impacted by the decisions being made in Washington.
So what can we do? It all feels so overwhelming, like we're just pawns in this political chess game.
I understand that feeling.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel powerless when things seem so chaotic and out of control. But we're not powerless. We have voices, and we have a responsibility to use them.
Okay, but how? What are some concrete steps we can take to make a difference?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Don't just rely on headlines or social media. Dig deeper. Seek out credible sources of information and challenge your own assumptions. The more informed we are, the better equipped we are to hold our leaders accountable.
It's about being an active citizen, not just a passive observer.
Exactly. And that means engaging in the political process, even if it feels messy and frustrating at times. Vote in every election. Contact your elected officials. Support organizations that align with your values.
It's about recognizing that we have a stake in this, that our voices matter, and that we can make a difference, even if it feels small.
It all starts with that recognition that we have power and that we have a responsibility to use it wisely.
Welcome back, everyone. Still with us as we try to make sense of this whirlwind of a week in Washington.
It's been a lot to take in, that's for sure.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground, from policy shifts that felt like they came out of nowhere, attacks on institutions, and of course, those eyebrow-raising trade wars.
It's hard to keep up. So as we wrap up this deep dive, the big question, the one we're all trying to answer is, what does this all mean for the future? For the future of Trump's presidency, I mean. What are we seeing here? Is there a pattern emerging?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately. But based on what we've seen so far, I think there are some insights we can glean, some educated guesses we can make.
Okay, lay it on us.
All right, so first off, I think we can expect more of the same when it comes to Trump's style of governing. He's shown us time and again that he prefers bold action. He's impulsive, he's not afraid of a fight, and he kind of seems to thrive on chaos.
So more surprises, more shakeups, more of those tweets that send everyone scrambling?
Probably, yeah. It's almost like,
Like a reality show.
Yeah, exactly. Except, of course, this isn't a reality show. This is real life with real consequences. And we've already seen how this approach can backfire big time, like with that grant freeze mess. Even a seemingly small misstep, it can create huge problems and really erode public trust.
Yeah, that was a major fumble. It's like he's constantly pushing the boundaries, seeing how far he can go before things break.
That's a good way to put it. And the thing is, the stakes are a lot higher now than they were during his first term. I mean, the country's more divided, the world's a more volatile place, the challenges we're facing are more complex. There's not a lot of room for error.
So we're bracing for impact, basically.
I think that's a safe bet.
All right, so more turbulence ahead. But what about his agenda? What about the things he wants to get done? Can he actually achieve his goals with this approach? Or is he going to be constantly battling controversy and gridlock?
Well, that's going to depend a lot on whether he can build consensus, whether he can work effectively with Congress. Even when he had a Republican majority, he still faced a ton of pushback on certain issues. Remember what happened with healthcare?
Oh, yeah.
That was a disaster. So if he keeps alienating moderate Republicans and Democrats with, his rhetoric and his actions, it's going to be really tough to get anything done.
So it's not just about having the numbers, it's about knowing how to use them, which so far doesn't seem to be his strong suit.
Right. It's about strategy, and so far we haven't seen a lot of evidence of strategic thinking from this administration.
Okay, so that's one thing to watch. What else should we be keeping an eye on?
Well, there's the whole issue of scandals and investigations. Trump's first presidency, it was like a magnet for controversy, and it looks like his second term is already heading down a similar path.
It feels like we're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. Those pardons, the way he's going after the Justice Department and the FBI, it's all pretty worrying.
Yeah, it definitely raises some red flags. The potential for scandal is always there. And that's something that could completely derail his agenda and, cause even more division in the country.
So are we headed for another impeachment inquiry? Is that what you're saying?
It's too early to say, honestly.
Yeah.
A lot will depend on what comes out of these investigations and on the political climate in Congress. But it's definitely a possibility.
Okay, not exactly reassuring, but let's try to end on a slightly more positive note, shall we? Are there any areas where you see potential for, I don't know, maybe some progress? Maybe even some bipartisan cooperation? Is there any hope in this rather bleak picture we're painting?
Well, one area that might offer some hope is infrastructure. There's been this long-standing agreement across party lines that the country needs to invest in roads, bridges, airports, all that stuff. It's been a problem for a long time.
So maybe a chance to put aside the partisan bickering and focus on something that actually benefits everyone.
That's the idea, yeah. Of course, any infrastructure plan, it's going to be scrutinized, debated, negotiated, the drill. But it's at least an area where there's potential for some common ground.
Okay, I'll hold on to that. We need some optimism these days. Well, I think it's safe to say that Trump's second week back in office, it was anything but boring.
Understatement of the year. It's been a week full of surprises, reversals, and, bold moves that are going to have an impact for a long time to come. And honestly, this is probably just a taste of what's to come.
So buckle up, everyone. It's going to be a wild ride. But as we navigate this crazy, unpredictable landscape, it's more important than ever to stay informed, engage in the process, make your voices heard, don't get discouraged.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into President Trump's second week back. We'll be back next week with another fascinating exploration of the news and events shaping our world. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.